Hello Year 11s and welcome to this fourth and final video in our series of 4 videos on criminal sanctions. In the first video we looked at the 5 purposes of criminal sanctions. In this video we look at fines and the extent to which they are able to achieve each of these 5 purposes. There are 4 things that you need to do while you're watching this video. The first thing is to take the very best Cornell notes that you can. The second thing is to use the pause and rewind functions. Use the pause function if you need to stop this video so that you can take notes. Use the rewind function if you've missed out on any information and you need to go back over that information. The third thing that you need to do is to have your vocabulary sheet open in front of you so that you can include in it definitions of important terms or of any other words that you're unfamiliar with. And the fourth thing that you need to do is to have your summary books open in front of you. As we go through this video, I will give you some guidance as to what you should include in your summary books. Once you've finished watching and taking notes on this video, make sure that you read the pages from the textbook referred to on this slide. And if you find any additional information in that reading that you think is useful, then please supplement your Cornell notes with that additional information. Well, let's get started then. On this slide, I've set out the 2 learning intentions for this video. Make sure that you write these learning intentions down in your Cornell notes. Our first learning intention is that you should be able to describe fines and their purposes. Our second learning intention is that you should be able to discuss the ability of fines to achieve the purposes of criminal sanctions. Let's start with our first learning intention, that is, that you should be able to describe fines and their purposes. The main purposes of a fine are to punish the offender, to discourage the offender from committing further offences in the future, that is, specific deterrence, and to discourage other members of the community from committing similar offences, that is, general deterrence. To understand the effectiveness of fines in achieving these 3 purposes, as well as the other purposes of criminal sanctions, you first have to understand what a fine entails. A fine is a monetary penalty expressed in penalty units that is paid to the government. Look down the left-hand side of your vocabulary sheets, find the term fine and write this definition in there. Currently, 1 penalty unit in Victoria equates to around $198. Now this looks a very odd number. The reason is that when penalty units were first introduced a number of years ago, a penalty unit equated to $100. However, every year a penalty unit's value is increased with inflation, so now a penalty unit equates to around $198. Here are a couple of important points that you must know about fines. First, a fine is paid to the government, not to the victim. That's because a fine is a punishment. It is not intended as compensation. Second, different offences attract different maximum fines. The maximum fines that can be imposed for offences vary from level 12 offences, where the maximum fine that can be imposed is 1 penalty unit, that is around $198, right up to level 2 offences, where the maximum fine that can be imposed is 3,000 penalty units, that is around $594,000. Third, a court doesn't have to impose the maximum fine for a particular offence. Instead, in determining the actual fine to impose on a particular offender for an offence, the court will take into account a range of factors. These include the offender's financial circumstances. In other words, do they have a substantial income or are they fairly poor? and the offender's responsibilities. For example, are they responsible for looking after a big family, or are they only responsible for looking after themselves? In addition, the court will take into account any property damage that has been caused by the offence. So, for instance, if the offender has been convicted of vandalism where they have destroyed property, then the fine might be correspondingly greater to take into account the fact that property damage has been caused. Another factor that the court will take into account in deciding the size of a fine in a particular case is the value of any benefit that the offender has received from the offence. So, for example, if the offence is one of fraud, where the offender has ripped off pensioners by swindling them out of their life savings, then the offender is likely to face a greater fine than otherwise, because the offender has received a benefit from their offence in the form of the money that they have taken away from those pensioners and that the offender may well have spent on themselves. Finally, the court will take into account any compensation order that has been made against the offender. You may recall that in criminal proceedings, a court can decide to require the offender to pay compensation to the victim. So, for example, in the case of a person who defrauds pensioners, then that offender may be required to pay to those pensioners an amount of compensation that is equal to the amount of money that they have ripped off those pensioners, and that will be taken into account in the size of the fine. The fine will be less if, in addition to the fine, the offender is required to compensate the people who are victims of that crime. The fourth point to note is that, as with community correction orders, when a court imposes a fine, it might decide to record a conviction against the offender. That is, the offender will have a criminal record. Or alternatively, the court might decide not to record a conviction so that the offender does not have a criminal record. It may be that an offender cannot afford to pay a fine that is ordered by the court. In such a case, there are various options open to the court. The court might order that the fine be paid by installments. That means, instead of the offender being required to pay the fine in a lump sum, the offender is required to pay off that fine by, for example, paying a part of that fine every month. Alternatively, the court may give the offender additional time to pay the fine. That is, instead of being required to pay the fine immediately on the court handing down its decision, the offender might be, say, given up to a year to pay the fine to give them time to earn the money needed to pay the fine. Finally, the court might order that the fine be converted into unpaid community work. That is, instead of having to pay a fine, the offender is required to do community service work for which they are not paid. It's a different story if an offender can pay a fine but refuses to pay the fine. That is contempt of court, because the offender is disobeying an order made by a court. In such a case, the court can issue a warrant for the arrest of the offender. The court can require that some of the offender's property is seized and sold, with the sale proceeds being used to pay the fine. And the court can order that the offender is imprisoned. You'll recall that our second learning intention requires you to be able to discuss the ability of fines to achieve the purposes of criminal sanctions. In this table, I'm going to set out the points that you could make when you are discussing the ability of fines to achieve the purposes of criminal sanctions. So make sure that you include this table in your summary books. You can see that I have set out each of the purposes of criminal sanctions across the top of this table. Let's turn first of all to punishment. A fine will be highly effective in punishing an offender if it imposes some kind of burden on the offender. For example, if a court imposed a $5,000 fine on an unemployed offender, then, because $5,000 is a lot of money if you're unemployed, the fine will impose a significant burden on that offender and will therefore be highly effective in punishing that offender. On the other hand, if the court were to impose a $5,000 fine on a millionaire, then because $5,000 is just a drop in the ocean for a millionaire, it doesn't impose a significant financial burden on the millionaire. And so, in that sense, the fine is not effective as a punishment. Having said this, a fine can still impose a significant burden on a wealthy offender because being convicted of an offence can seriously damage their reputation. For instance, if a wealthy lawyer is fined for stealing their client's money, then the fact that the lawyer has a criminal conviction for theft will severely damage the lawyer's reputation. No client will want to use a lawyer who has been convicted of stealing their client's money. In these circumstances, a fine will impose a burden on the lawyer and so will be an effective punishment, not because of the size of the fine, but because of the damage that has been done to the lawyer's reputation. The lawyer will no longer be able to earn money as a lawyer because their reputation as a thief means that the lawyer will lose all of their clients. In terms of specific deterrence, as with punishment, whether a fine is effective in deterring or discouraging an offender from committing further offences will depend upon whether the fine imposes a burden on that offender. If the fine imposes a financial burden on the offender or damages the offender's reputation, then the fine is likely to be highly effective as a specific deterrent. Having said this, the effectiveness of a fine as a specific deterrent is likely to be low if the reason the offender committed the offence is something that will continue to exist unless the offender is rehabilitated. For example, if the offender committed the offence because of a drug addiction, then a fine is not likely to discourage the offender from committing further offences because the drug addiction is what is driving the offender to reoffend, and a fine does not remove that drug addiction. A fine will, however, be highly effective as a general deterrent if the fine is large and if the imposition of the fine is widely reported. In these circumstances, other potential offenders are likely to be aware of the fine that has been imposed on the offender, and they will be discouraged from committing similar offences because they will not want to risk having to pay such a large fine themselves. Conversely, a fine is not very effective at achieving rehabilitation of the offender, as it does not treat any underlying cause of the offending, such as where the offence is caused by the offender's addiction to drugs, alcohol, or gambling, or where the offence is caused by the offender's inability to manage their anger issues. Where an offender has problems like this, the offender is likely to reoffend because their offending is driven by causes that are outside their control and that can only be removed by some kind of treatment. A fine does not provide this treatment. However, a very severe fine can be very highly effective for the purpose of denunciation. Where a court wants to show its disapproval of an offender's conduct, then it can do this by imposing a very high fine that is at or close to the maximum fine that can be imposed for the offence. And finally, fines are not very effective at community protection. This is because a fine is a non-custodial sanction, and so the offender is free in the community and is able to commit further offences. Well, that brings us to the end of this video. As a result of watching and taking notes on this video, you should now be able to do two things. First, you should be able to describe fines and their purposes. And second, you should be able to discuss the ability of fines to achieve the purposes of criminal sanctions. You now need to read the pages from the textbook that are referred to on the first slide. And if you find any additional information from that reading that you think is useful, then please supplement your Cornell notes with that additional information. This completes our series of 4 videos on sanctions. In summary, as a result of watching and taking notes on each of these 4 videos, you should now be able to do 2 things. The first is to be able to describe the purposes of criminal sanctions, that is, the purposes that we looked at in the first video. The second is to be able to discuss the ability of each of the 3 criminal sanctions, that is, imprisonment, community correction orders, and fines, to achieve these purposes. Thank you very much for your attention.